All right, so if you're trying to get your head around the foundations of IFRS S2, then you are in exactly the right spot. In this explainer, we're going to break down the absolute essentials of the climate disclosure standard, really getting into the details that matter for experts like you. So, let's get right into it.
Okay, here's a quick look at our roadmap. We're going to start with the core objective, the big why. Then we'll nail down the scope. After that, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of governance, looking at it from the top down, from the board to management. And to wrap it all up, we'll talk about how to pull it all together for seamless integrated disclosures. Let's go. All right, first up, the core objective. Before we get into the weeds on anything, we've got to understand the why behind this whole standard. It's really the key to everything else.
So, take a look at the language here, straight from the standard. This isn't just about disclosure for disclosure's sake, right? The whole point, the absolute core of it, is to give primary users, we're talking investors, lenders, you name it, information that's actually useful. Useful for what? For making those big decisions about where to put their money. This idea right here, it's the foundation for everything else in S2.
And here's where the rubber meets the road. So what kind of information are we talking about? It's anything that could reasonably be expected to hit your company's financials. We're talking about real, tangible impacts on your cash flows, your access to finance, or even what you pay for capital. This is the critical link, right? It's what ties climate-related info directly to the bottom line. Okay, so now that we know why we're disclosing, let's talk about what we're disclosing. What exactly falls under the umbrella of climate-related risks and opportunities? Let's define the scope. So the standard basically breaks risks down into two big buckets. First, you've got your physical risks. This is the stuff you can see and feel. The acute things like hurricanes and wildfires, but also the slower, chronic stuff like rising sea levels. Then, on the other side, you have transition risks, and this is all about the massive shift to a low-carbon world. Think about it. Policy changes, new technologies. A perfect example is the car industry, right? The explosion of EVs creates enormous transition risk for legacy automakers. You've got to think about both sides of this coin.
All right, let's shift gears to governance. This is a huge piece of the puzzle, and we're going to start right at the top of the food chain with board-level responsibility.
So what's the goal with governance disclosures? Well, it all boils down to one word: transparency. It's about letting users peek under the hood to understand how your company is actually steering the ship on climate issues. It's not good enough to just say, yeah, we're on it. You have to lay out the real processes, the controls, the procedures that are actually in place.
And believe me, the standard gets really specific here. You have to spell out exactly how climate responsibilities are handed out. Then you need to explain how the board knows it actually has the right skills and expertise for the job. You also have to disclose how often the board gets briefed on climate stuff. And, of course, how climate is baked into the big decisions: strategy, major deals, risk management. And finally, and this one is so important, how the board is actually keeping an eye on the targets you've set and tracking progress.
And that point about skills, that's a huge one, isn't it? It's one of the biggest practical challenges here. I mean, it's easy to say your board has the right competencies, but how do you actually prove it? What's your process for finding the gaps and filling them? How do you demonstrate that your leadership is truly equipped to navigate this? That's a tough question, and every single company is going to need a really good answer.
Okay, so we've talked about the view from 30,000 feet with the board. Now let's get down to the ground level, to management's role. This is all about who's executing on that strategy every single day.
When it comes to management, the disclosure requirements really focus on two things. First, who is in charge? You need to point to the specific person or committee that owns this and explain how they exercise that oversight. And second, how are they doing it? You've got to describe the actual controls and procedures they're using, and this is key, how all of that is woven into the fabric of the rest of the business, like your risk and finance teams.
And here's a great practical example of what that could look like in the real world. Think about a manufacturing company. They don't have to go and create some massive, brand new bureaucracy for this. Nope. They could just bake a quarterly climate risk review right into their existing financial audit process. It's smart, it's efficient, and it embeds climate thinking right into the normal rhythm of the business.
All right, this brings us to our last and maybe most important point: how to make all of this work without drowning in paperwork. We need to connect the dots between S2 governance and the bigger S1 requirements, and do it efficiently.
And the good news is, the standard itself gives us the solution. This one little line you see here is an absolute game changer. It literally says, avoid unnecessary duplication. The whole idea is to stop creating separate siloed reports and instead weave this information together in a way that just makes sense. So the big takeaway here is really simple, but it's incredibly powerful. If you're already looking at climate risk as part of your broader sustainability picture, alongside things like water or supply chain issues, you don't have to write a separate governance story for each one. You can, and you absolutely should, present one single integrated governance disclosure. It saves you a ton of work, and frankly, it gives investors a much clearer, more holistic picture of how you manage risk.
And so that leaves us with a final question to take back to your own organization. Take a hard look at your current structure and ask yourself, are we really ready to do this? Are we set up to integrate climate oversight effectively? I don't mean just adding it as another line item on the agenda. I mean truly embedding it into the core of your strategy and risk management. Because at the end of the day, this is so much more than a compliance exercise. It's about building a smarter, more resilient, and future-proof business.